Good afternoon, all, and I want to welcome everybody here to this session of LSP, where we have the author meeting parents, let me say. So I want to welcome Reggie, how are you?
Oh, I'm fine, thank you.
Welcome once again. Marloes, how are you? You can see you there. I said, okay, we will. So offer meets readers this session. And,
I think that's all it's supposed to
is she on now?
be.
Sure. So we are expecting Mustafa Bello to join us either live or virtually. Don't move forward at least so. Don't like, don't feel intimidated.
Oh no, you're welcome. Yeah, it's popping in and out. But I think we're going to be fine. We'll make a decent feast of it.
Well, maybe among the three of us.
I said it several sessions over the past days. It went fine most of the time. It's just this panel. So.
Yeah.
It will work out.
It's always difficult crossing boundaries, isn't it?
Oh, very appropriate. Hey, and Ebenezer, where are you at the moment?
I'm in DC right now.
I see.
Yeah. So I left the university. I'm with the Council on Foreign Relations.
Say something. I think so.
Are you with us now?
We don't see you now, but we see
Yeah.
yes.
We see each other, but we don't see you, Abdul.
Now we do.
We can see you now.
See you.
Marloes, how are you?
I'm fine. Good to see you all, and thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you very much. So when the session, as we know, often meets readers. And on the panel here, of course, we have those of us on ground here. We have also Sanusi, my far right, and just next to her, my immediate right is Leman for the University of Vermont. And online there is my old associate from Netherlands, Project Maya. You're welcome. And we also have Professor Mother, the Council of Foreign Relations. You're welcome. When we are expecting Mustafa Bello to join us, we used to call him Marloes husband in Nigeria. Nothing evil is meant. But he works very closely with the Marloes and this particular project. So welcome to all. And I want to give the ground now to the author to give us an introduction of what the work is all about. The title of the book, as you know, is Crossing Religious Boundaries, Islam, Christianity, and Yoruba Religion in Lagos. So, and we will use the floor now to Marloes to give us an idea of what the work is all about. And then ask the various contributors to share their views and thoughts on the work. So, Marloes, you have the floor and the heaven.
Oh, thanks a lot, Amidou Sani, and thank you so much for chairing this panel, and thank you to all the panelists for joining. Do you hear me correctly, or? Okay. Also the people in the room. Okay, thanks. So, and many apologies for not being able to join you in person. I would have loved to be there in the room, but I conducted research in Lagos just 2 months ago, and I I'm currently stuck in London, unfortunately. But still, it's a great honor to present my book to you. And the title of the book, as Amadou already mentioned, is Crossing Religious Boundaries, Islam, Christianity, and Yoruba Religion in Lagos, Nigeria. And I'm particularly pleased to present it here at the Lagos Studies Association because my book is situated in Lagos. And I'm very pleased to present it with such a nice panel because all the people here, either on, in the Zoom boxes or on the table, their work inspired me in writing this book. And they have served as so the book was published by Cambridge University Press in 2021, and it came out in a much more affordable paperback edition in 2023. So the book came out during the pandemic, so it went a little bit under the radar. So I'm particularly pleased to present it today. So to open the discussion, let me briefly contextualize the book for you. As the title suggests, the book crosses religious boundaries. And my monograph is an attempt to develop a new framework to study multi-religious encounters that is not organized around separation and demarcation, but that is devoted to drawing out similarities, differences, and entanglements between Islam, Christianity, and Yoruba religion in Nigeria's former capital, Lagos. And although Islam and Christianity dominate the religious landscape in Lagos, Yoruba religion still plays a very vital role. So challenging the evolutionary perspective that typifies the study of religion in Africa, my book studies Christianity, Islam, and Yoruba religion as contemporaries. And I employ pluralism in my book as a heuristic device, referring to the mixing of different religious traditions in Lagos cityscape, where religious practitioners who self-identify as religious shoppers, and I think this is a fantastic term, it's not my term, it was a term used by my research participants, who engage simultaneously with different religious traditions. And according to the religious shoppers whom I interviewed, if one is in need of deliverance, understood by the Yoruba notion of alafia, a condition of well-being with health and prosperity as its main components, one cannot afford to be picky. Instead, one picks and chooses in the hope that by assembling elements from different religious traditions, one increases one's chances of having a good life. And as already mentioned, my book is situated in Yoruba land, and that's for those of you who are not familiar with the setting, but I think that's a very small percentage in this room. Yoruba land is a multi-faith setting in southwestern Nigeria, where Christians, Muslims, and practitioners of Yoruba religion have lived together relatively harmoniously since the 19th century. Indeed, many extended families in Yoruba land are composed of Christians, Muslims, and practitioners of Yoruba religion. And mutual participation in each other's ritual festivities is a standard feature of Yoruba social life, as also Inza Nolte, who is present today, shows in her book, which inspired me in writing this book. So given its particular religious constellation, it is not surprising that the movements that are central in my book originate in Yoruba land. It is the shared culture and the shared ethnicity that makes the appropriation of Christian elements by Yoruba Muslims and vice versa possible, but also acceptable. And some of the movements on which I focus in my book have branches also elsewhere in Yoruba land, but they expanded fastest in Yoruba's land's cosmopolitan center, Lagos. Lagos' huge population, it has an estimated population of over 20 million, and its process of rapid urbanization contribute to a sense of life that is turbulent and hectic, where survival depends on improvisation, risk-taking, and ingenuity. And in this urban environment, pluriform movements that combine elements from multiple religious traditions are not considered contradictions in terms, but rather as an example of the resourcefulness of Lagosians, that's the inhabitants of Lagos, who by adopting elements from Christianity, Islam, or by religion, increase their chances of having a good life. And the most prominent case of religious pluralism in Yoruba land is, I think, Chrislam. And that's a series of religious movements that mix Christian and Muslim beliefs and practices. So complementing the typical image of Nigeria as a country being torn by religious clashes and violence, the case of Chrislam illustrates that religious rivalry is just one aspect of Christian-Muslim manifold relations. The underlying idea in Chrislam is that to be a Christian or a Muslim alone is not enough to guarantee success in this world and the hereafter. And therefore, Chrislamists, as they refer to themselves, participate in Christian and Muslim rituals, appropriating the perceived powers of both. Now, besides Chrislam, my book also comprises case studies of the Muslim mass organization Nasfat, which is inspired by Pentecostal prayer styles and techniques. The indigenous faith of Africa, Iyo Orunmila Ato, which combines mainline Christianity with Yoruba religion, as well as case studies of the Grill movement and Ekanka. These are movements who originated outside of Nigeria and who combine different religious traditions in a kind of eclectic mix. So megacity Lagos does not just form the backdrop against which I study these pluriform movements in my book, but also the producer of new forms of religiosity. So what I try to do in my book is studying how religiosity and urbanity mutually constitute each other. And the pluriform movements, as a central in my book, are an anthropological studies of religion often referred to in terms of syncretism. Syncretic forms of African Christianity or African Islam, a dilution of a so-called pure religion with African beliefs and practices. And my book questions this very analytical framework of syncretism, and it proposes a new comparative model for shedding a fresh light on religious mixing. And drawing on Deleuze and Guattari, I employ assemblage theory as a lens through which to study the emergent and the fluid nature of new religious movements that have cropped up in Lagos since the religious revival of the 1970s. And in these novel formations or assemblages, as I call them, Christianity, Islam, and Yoruba religion are not synthesized into new syncretic religions, but rather exist side by side. And the merit of taking assemblage as a conceptual frame lies, I think, in the fact that it allows us, it invites us to think outside of boundedness, and it allows for studying religion as lived, which necessitates the mixing of elements from various religious traditions. And from this perspective, then, religious pluralism is no longer a problem opposing the tradition of monism, but is rather an opportunity to offer a fresh perspective on religious mixing in multi-faith settings. Now, to conclude, my point in the book is that if we want to gain a better understanding of the dynamics of multi-faith settings, such as Yoruba land in southwestern Nigeria, we must bridge the common divide in the study of religion along theological boundaries, and we must go beyond ready-made binary oppositions, such as Christianity versus Islam, and traditional local versions of religion versus the so-called modern world religions. Now, the challenge for us as scholars of religion is to develop a new comparative framework to explore mutual influences and entanglements between different religious traditions that moves away from ingrained concepts like syncretism and conventional understandings of Christian-Muslim relations in terms of either religious conflict or cooperation. And religious pluralism may then turn into a political asset. The Yoruba can teach us an important lesson, I think, about how different religious traditions can live together in peace. Now, here I would like to stop so that to allow discussion about the book, but I hope this briefly contextualized the book and what my main aims and objectives are. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present. So over to Amadou. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much. And I think let me use my prerogative as the chairman to pose some questions first, which I think Marloes will have to address in our mind too. Now, this issue of Islam, how acceptable is it either to Muslims or Christians? I mean, there's this idea that Islam is more or less like a religious prostitution, neither Islam nor Christianity. Not accepted by the Muslims nor by Christians. So now, where do you situate Islam now? In the reading, in the psyche of the Muslims, and in that of the Christians as well. That's number one. Number two, now, you talk about Nasfat being the Islamic Pentecostalism. I'm not sure whether they will agree, members of Nasfat will ever agree with you that they are an Islamic version of Pentecostalism. What is Pentecostalism all about? Well, Nasfat, because we know of them are upward mobile government professionals. And I think you need to find out, will they accept the term or the tag being Pentecostal within Islam? And that's what we want to talk about. Then lastly, before I give another person the chance, is that now, you seem to be talking only about ordinary persons, ordinary Nigerians, ordinary Lagosians, who go for religious shopping. I don't know whether you observed in the past 2 days, the South African president came to the mosque to observe that prayer. I will see that it was very jittery. When people were standing, we were sitting, and of course, nobody would ever think. I mean, he knew that he was also shopping for political votes. Also had that in Nigeria as well, where Muslim politicians also go to the seaside or to the beach, also to join the celestial church people to pray. They say God is everywhere. So what I'm trying to say is that the idea of shopping is not limited only to ordinary Nigerians for negotiation, but across social and other economic spectrum. Thank you very much. And just my thought. And I now ask Professor.
Number 5.
Oh, okay. Well, Mustafa, I'm not sure Mustafa is with us. Mustafa is not with us. Vicky. Okay. Yeah, Vicky. So, yeah, Vicky, you have also 10 minutes.
Okay.
Then about to for your view, and I think we are going to talk about secularism.
Okay, thank you. So I'm really excited to be here. This is an amazing book, as I've said, and this is also an amazing panel of conversationalists. So, but I'm going to read my comments so that I make sure I stay on topic. So Crossing Religious Boundaries is a truly excellent study of the dynamics of religious pluralism in Lagos. Janson presents 4 fascinating case studies that demonstrate the religious dynamism of Lagos, ranging from Chrislam to Nasfat, from the Ijo Oromila to the Grail movement. These cases are used to substantiate Janson's claims about religion that rather than being a bounded set of traditions, texts, practices, and worldviews, instead religion is better understood as a lived phenomenon constituted by experimental mixing. In doing so, Janson de-essentializes both the scholarly category of religion more generally, as well as the assumptions made by both scholars and practitioners alike about the constitution of traditions such as Christianity, Islam, and Yoruba religion. Instead, Janson focuses on religion as lived in everyday encounters in the multi-level entanglements of people, ideas, practices, aesthetics, objects, and spaces. In doing so, Janson definitively closes the analytical door on thinking about religious mixing in terms of syncretism. Thank you. Her analysis shows the limits of syncretism as a model for religious mixture, not just because syncretism assumes that religious traditions are already coherent founded forms, but more importantly, she points to the limiting assumptions embedded in theories of syncretism that the mixture must resolve tensions or contradictions between those forms. Instead, Janson uses assemblage theory to frame her study, in doing so emphasizing the fluidity, dynamism, ambiguity, and contingency sorry, of religious formations, of religion encounters, choices, and practices. This allows for a more nuanced understanding of the ways in which people orient themselves towards religion, whether they orient themselves through mixing, matching, selecting, or even doubling down on fundamentalist arguments that assert strict boundaries around religious. So I'm not going to dwell too long on this. This is my sort of summary of what I thought the main points of the book was. And I know others here are going to talk more about assemblage, which I think there's a lot to talk about in this book. But I want to offer some observations and questions about how the category of the secular figures into this book's arguments, examples, and conclusions. What role might the secular play in expanding on and perhaps even extending Janson's critique of the category of religion? And I'm thinking here of the provocations raised in Matthew Engelke's article about the secular shadows cast by the exclusion of Africa from theories and discussions of secularism, and the ways that secular formations produce shadows in and for Africa, especially in scholarship produced in the North Atlantic, such as our own. So Engelke asks, where is Africa in our understanding of the secular? And we might expand it here to ask, where is Nigeria, or where is Lagos in our understanding of the secular? But I also want to reverse that and ask, where is the secular in Lagos and in Nigeria, and how might it complicate some of the cases you've discussed in this book? And how might, then to turn it back again, how might your discussion in your analysis of pluralism in Lagos complicate the category of the secular as much as it complicates the category of religion? So just briefly, Engelke runs through a number of theories and arguments about secularism and their invocation of and application to African contexts, specifically to the post-colonial. His critique focuses squarely on the arguments offered by Charles Taylor, understandably given the attention that his 2007 book, The Secular Age, has received from scholars of religion more generally. So as Engelke notes, Taylor's story of secularism is largely a normative project. As Engelke puts it, the book might best be understood as an ethnological reflection on how the natives of Latin Christendom think and how those patterns of thought have changed over time. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of Engelke's argument for those who haven't read it. So in doing so, the particular forms that secularism take are partially determined in relationship to an imagination of Africa as lacking secular. So Engelke considers how the main characteristics that are typically associated with secularism by theorists, such as Taylor and others, disenchantment, an emphasis on immanence over transcendence, the openness of a system that offers options for interpretations and practices, and importantly, the centrality of doubt and critique, that all of these things have used the idea of Africa and African religion as a figuration against which the secular can define itself. It is in this way that it appears that Africa has never been secular. This is what Engelke is suggesting. So yet, as Engelke notes, and I quote, secularism's normative demands force not only particular ways of seeing, but also particular kinds of questions, pointing to the ways that secularism is framed by scholars such as Taylor and as taken up by anthropologists such as Tanya Luhrmann, who can only see African communities, practices, and ideas in relation to the frames offered by the distinction between the religious and the secular itself. Instead, Engelke suggests that this is a misreading of the situation through North Atlantic frameworks, that, quote, we should not underestimate the extent to which religious change was also changed to religion. That is to say, that what happened throughout much of colonial Africa was not a shift within transcendental and supernatural orientation, but rather a shift to them. Right, that African religions were actually already pragmatic and open, and the enchantment of them was different from the enchantment that secularism sees itself as moving against. Right? And so to further make this case, Engelke turns to Professor Barber's classic essay on how humans make gods in Yoruba religions, pointing to the ways that it centers Yoruba religious orientations around skepticism and choice, which are seen as key markers of the secular, and suggesting that skepticism itself needs to be specified and understood within cultural frames. As Engelke notes, countering the social evolutionary assumptions embedded in arguments about secularism, quote, we can argue that in other times and in other places, belief comes after doubt, that pragmatism rather than piety might form the core of what we doubt religiosity. And I think we can see how this tracks well with much of what you're talking about in this book. So to return to Janson's books and the arguments and cases she discusses there, I'm wondering to what extent might the secular and secular formations play in the discussions offered here? In particular, how does Engelke's argument complicate the depiction of Lagos as a religious marketplace structured by supply and demand? And further, you use the Yoruba category of Olaju, referring to a social state of increased knowledge and awareness that serves as the condition for colonialism or for progress and development. But you use that as a way of characterizing the openness to religion that many Yoruba have. How might that category be further complicated in reference to Engelke's suggestion that colonialism and globalization have pushed African societies further towards the supernatural rather than merely serving as a means through which to express, or this is a different model of progress or historical development. This might be especially useful for fully addressing the way that Yoruba religion has, as Janson puts it, become secularized and represented as culture, so that practicing Muslims and Christians can then honor what makes the Yoruba distinctive as a people. And I'm quoting you here from page 26. Janson also notes the ways that Chrislam had to engage with the secular state in order to be recognized, arguing that it, well, shows that the Nigerian state regulates religious life and politicizes religion through the law on unlawful societies. And so more specifically, I wonder if you could speak more broadly about how, if other places where the secular appeared, as you followed people through their religious pathways or engaged with practitioners who see mixture as central to their practices. Can you expand on your argument about the ways that secularism and Christianity have become linked in Nigeria, and your assertion that, quote, again, and it has to come back to assemblage, I think, because that's central to this book, right? But your assertion that studying religion and secularism as part of an assemblage is more accurate and provides a better understanding of the operation of religious pluralism in Nigeria's secular political field. Right, so there's like two seculars there, and I guess I want to understand both what that relationship is, and then how can we expand that further? And so there's two parts to my question. First, how might approaching religion and secularism as assemblage expand the analysis offered in some of the other cases here? And I'm thinking especially about the Grail movement and because they're so closely linked to kind of global forms of spirituality and ways people are distancing themselves from religion, and particularly like in the United States, as people come to identify themselves as spiritual but not religious, right? So do you see, though, the people who are connecting themselves to the Grail or to act as similarly sort of tracking themselves in relation to an idea of religion that's shaped by an idea that's secular? That makes sense. Okay. And then my second question is what secular formations other than the state are at work here? So, for example, we might think the university would be a secular site, but as we know it, universities in Lagos and Southwest Nigeria more generally are central sites of religion. Okay, we're back. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm finishing up. Okay. Right. So my second question is about other secular formations than the state. So I talked about universities as not necessarily being that site, though certainly universities have some forms of secular engagement with knowledge, criticism, etc. And what to make of what is perhaps a growing disengagement among Nigerian youth towards Christianity and Islam. And the emergence of a small but vocal group of atheists in Nigeria. And I just learned in a presentation this morning about the Ranting Atheist podcast that is run by a Nigerian. And I also heard about the case of Mubarak Bala, who's been arrested course, denouncing Islam and asserting sort of secular humanist atheism. And these were both examples discussed in a paper I heard earlier today, right? So it's like the secular is here. Where is it in relationship to what you're talking about, I guess? And then how does what you're talking about help us rethink the secular in what I think are really important ways? And so those are my questions. I hope that it came through clear, even with the hybrid. And I just want to thank you again for writing such a clear, engaging, and thought-provoking book. It's really, truly wonderful. And everyone here should read it. Everyone should read it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vicky, for your beautiful presentation. But I think I want our author to take also this way in our stride. And I think I want to feel that let us concentrate on this very discussion. Now, the idea of secularism as a binary for religiosity, I think in the Nigerian context, has different interpretation, so to say. And the fact of the matter is that the government, according to the constitution, doesn't want to be seen to be aligned to any particular religion. And that's the theory. But in practice, you have the government subsidizing people going to Hajj, subsidizing those going to Jerusalem. So it doesn't mean having nothing to do with religion at all. What we are finding here, more or less a modified form of secularism, a modified form of religiosity, which of course has different interpretation among the political class and of course the common people. And that is just what I want to draw your attention to. Then again, we know that as a matter of fact, the idea of secularism, whether among the Muslims or the Christians or the religious people, and I think that as well is properly defined. The Yoruba religion as defined also seems to be an amalgam of some Christianity, some of Islam, and some of traditional religion. And I think it doesn't work that way. People say, well, I'm a Muslim, I can still practice our family tradition, so to say. I'm a Christian, I can still practice. So that is the tradition, so to say, in the Nigerian, the Yoruba context. But I think something for you to think about when you are responding to the inquiry. So thank you very much again, Vicky, for your presentation on secularism and the Nigerian system. And I think to also go online again now, learn gender sensitive again. Everybody's out. And I think you want to come around now, this will have a bridge, so to speak.
You want me to go next?
Don't let me stop the other. Bridget, okay. So Bridget, you are the next on the according to the list we have here.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Is it okay? Can you hear me well?
Very well.
Okay. Well, I just want to start by saying that it is very much through Marloes' work that I have read about Lagos, her work on the spiritual highway, and then this book. And this means that I'm all the more sorry that I'm not there with you. In fact, I have never visited Lagos, apart from being stuck at the airport once. And this would have been a wonderful opportunity. Well, but I hope there will be another time. But I'm really sorry I cannot be there. Well, our chair made a very good suggestion, saying that we should all focus on certain aspects of the title. And for me, it was very clear. I wanted to focus on the phrase crossing religious boundaries. And I think this is really a nice part of the title that interests me a lot. Because as we learned from Thomas Tweed, religion itself is about crossing and dwelling. And yet, crossing boundaries between religions seems to be incredibly difficult to conceptualize. And this is, of course, where Marloes comes in with this major intervention. And she says that there is a problem with the scholarship, which we have inherited as scholars working on Africa. Boundaries, but presumed boundaries between religions have shaped the study of religion. And for long, it has even been affordable to look just at one tradition. So I myself, I think for the first 10, 15 years of my work on Africa, I focused on Christianity, historical mission churches, Pentecostals, and so on, in some exchanges with indigenous traditions, but Islam was left out. Of course, this is in a way untenable if we look at the present world, where indeed religious traditions coexist, but also in a way get entangled with each other. And it's good that Benjamin Suarez, to whom Marloes refers, also signaled this issue. And in fact, also Brian Larkin and myself signaled it. But then you see already a problem in the paper by Brian and myself, for I write about Christianity and he writes about Islam. And we talk about the desirability of bringing things together. Now, Marloes does exactly that. And that is so exciting about this book. It's very important that she makes this focus to look at ways in which adherence to different religious traditions coexist, because this is in line with reality, especially with urban realities, which are, of course, hotspots for creativity, for imitation, mixing, and indeed crossing boundaries, expanding them, making people being in motion all the time. In the introduction, Marloes introduces a certain character called Prince Charles, which is already a nice name, I think. And this is a man, I think, just reaching 40, and he is anxious. He expects his downfall. He is eager for a solution. And then he finds Islam, which he says is the best of both. Important here is that he, as other Lagosians, recognizes boundaries. The point is that he himself engages in creative crossing. So the point is not, and that is what I find very important also in Marloes' book, the point is not that boundaries would not exist in his perception, but the point is that scholars have a problem because we tend to see boundaries as keeping adherents of different religions apart, which practically is not at all the case. But we have failed to realize this in full. The boundaries are there, they are identifiable, but how they are dealt with is the question. And perhaps one could also think of something like a space of an interstice, perhaps taking that from Simmel, where people exist between all kinds of influences and possibilities and work with that. I'm very grateful to Marloes that she points out that the strong focus on and the primacy grant is a remnant of a theological the field. Often there is talk about secular legacies in the study of religion, but this is a theological one. Of course, theology played an important role in the making of religion in Africa and also creating certain boundaries in our heads, making scholars be concerned for very long about mixing and so on, syncretism and so on. And yes, we need to move beyond this. And Marloes offers really a very important, fresh and creative book that is just food for thought, and it gives us directions. I have 3 points, which in fact are intended to further flesh out the idea of crossing. The first point, crossing is fueled by shopping, and Marloes just referred to shopping again. Marloes suggests the metaphor of the religious marketplace and the idea of shopping around, and she talks about religious shoppers. Nonetheless, I wonder whether this metaphor is really appropriate, even regarding the American context for which it was framed in the 90s by Stark and Bainbridge. I have some doubts. My point is not that I refuse to think about religion from an economic or capitalist angle. That's fine for me. But can the concept be transferred from the US to Nigeria so easily? Yes, it is an emic term when people speak English, even though in the case of Ekankar, people prefer to talk about seeking rather than shopping. But what does shopping really mean? How would it be used in Yoruba, for example? I know that there is a Yoruba term for shopping, itaya. Would that be the term being used? I see a problem of translation here. I even wonder whether we find an older substrate linking to ways of buying charms, religious stuff, so as to enhance one's power and so on. So I would really think that the whole question of the marketplace and the shopper, even if it's emic, needs further fleshing out anthropologically, and also a rethinking how the religious marketplace in Nigeria would differ from the one in the US. And I think there may be big differences. Second, pluralism is, of course, a field in which crossing is the default, is the normality. And that is a very, very good idea. Marloes introduces a new take on religious pluralism beyond a binary logic via lived religion and practices. So it is a default rather than a problem. And as said, this is good. But I still wonder whether your grassroots focus can fully do the job. Don't we have to analyze in more depth how the state assigns places to religions and regulates religion? The very term pluralism, of course, as it has been coined, for example, by Peter Berger as a secular way of organizing the coexistence of religion in a secular context, right? Secular context does not mean religion are to go away, but they are to be regulated in a particular way. So I wonder whether this pluralism concept should not be analyzed more, and whether, as is the case with the marketplace that comes from the US, in a way, also pluralism as a concept would have to be fleshed out a bit more. I also think it is important to take into account, perhaps more strongly, we have discussed that before, how the Nigerian state regulates religion, and also how other bodies in civil society regulate coexistence. For there is very clearly also in your book evidence of an allowance for certain mixes, but also an interdiction, as with Chrislam, which has been forbidden at certain moments. So I think it would be very interesting to unpack this further. And here I see a fruitful line for discussion also with Vicky and the points Vicky brought in. In a way, I would argue that the Nigerian state is a secular state, regulates religions in a particular way, but this secularity is different from the secularity as we know it. I don't really believe in saying that Africa is all religious all the time. I find that conceptually problematic, and I believe you also think so. So I think there's a whole line for further research here, which you could also help us to flesh out. And then my third point, I will make it brief. I always wonder, why is it so difficult to theorize flux and motion and crossing, in a way, crisscross, so to speak? People always being on the move, searching something. I think it is high time to, as I also called it in a recent piece, to mobilize theory in a double way. We need more mobile theories to allow us to better understand people's mobility. This is, of course, easier said than done, because as scholars, we always freeze. We cannot think without delineating, drawing distinctions, and in between or limbo is always difficult to fathom. And I think, Marloes, you offer very important incentives. You talk about and rather than either or. You introduce the figure of the assemblage, something Vicky also commented on. You have a thoroughly relational approach as a method, so as to see and realize new things. And I think this will allow us to mobilize theory in a fresh manner. And I much hope that we can pursue such a project in the future with you, Marloes, and also other people on this panel. For otherwise, we may remain stuck, whereas our interlocutors are moving about. Okay, thanks for allowing me to come in here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for sticking to the time allotted to the presentation. And I think Marloes is having her plate full now, the best is to contend with. And also, I want to say that this idea of shopping has an inherent idea of transaction, so to say. So you are shopping for something, that's something transactional, business-like. But those who go for Islam or Islam, they are not actually looking for something material, so to say. So you have to rethink the idea of this religious shopping, whether it is actually worthwhile or not. Then again, I would point it out this one, I want to call Islam more, or Black Islam, African Islam. The same you can think of secularism to the African context. What we have is what can call the abbreviated secularism in the African context. So it's not full-blown secularism. So thank you very much. I think we have more time to discuss this issue of religious shopping or not shopping at all. Yes, we'll move next to our next contributor discussion, and that is Professor Psychology from the University of Birmingham. Yes, sir.
Good evening, it's actually not fantastic.
It's your turn.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the contribution. I will try to refer to them as I go through my points. So I would like to reiterate the point that this is a wonderful book for many reasons. For me in particular, the focus on a large number of religious groups beyond either the Muslim-Christian divide or the boundary between missionary, monotheist, and traditional religion. That gives us a chance to reflect on religious multiplicity proper, right, in the way that Marloes set out on our contribution. For me, the book's focus on religious boundaries is central to the argument in two ways. First, it offers a guide to understanding how individuals see themselves and the religion they practice in relation to religious others. Religion is central to the lives of many Lagosians, not because it must be followed blindly, but because it provides a framework that guides the ongoing search for answers, insights, and solutions that help people to understand themselves, others, and the world. I have in my mind now replaced the idea of shopping with this framework. I recognize this, but that's actually how I read this book, so forgive me. So it is from this framework of, whether it is Christianity, Islam, the Urmila, that individuals engage with practices, dispositions, and ideas they encounter elsewhere, including secular ideas. In some cases, such outside practices can be included into or practiced in addition to existing traditions. In other words, across the religious boundary. In other cases, such practices will be rejected, and in many cases, the matter is hotly debated. So one of the book's wonderful case studies focuses on the debate surrounding the adoption of night vigils, which Marloes associates very strongly with the Pentecostal tradition by the Muslim organization Nasrat. And I mentioned that here because I would like to come back to this example of my question. As others have noted, and Marloes himself has pointed out, the adoption of these elements from the outside does not necessarily denote hybridity or syncretism. To make her case here, Marloes engages with debates about intertextuality, which I find very helpful. That is in chapter 2 or 3. I'm sorry, I did not bring the book along. Right, so in this discussion about the night vigils. So this allows us to recognize that, like chunks of speech, which might be taken from one context and moved into another, where they take a different meaning, maybe an ironic meaning, or where they set up a particular expectation that has a different meaning in a different text or in a different genre. Chunks of religious practice imported from elsewhere. Here, Marloes argues Pentecostal Christianity into an Islamic context, take on the character of the new religious environment or frame. In other words, when nighttime prayer in the Pentecostal mode is adopted and reconceived by Muslims in the context of Islamic practice, it becomes a distinctively Islamic practice. It becomes, as she notes, Jude, am I pronouncing it correctly? A distinctive Muslim form of night prayer. Again, I will come back to this. Secondly, boundaries are central to the book's key focus on what Marloes calls religious assemblage, which emphasizes that most of the processes of boundary crossing, the inclusion and rejection of practices at this point in time and in Lagos reflect the local importance of Pentecostalism. In other words, the concept of assemblage in the book helps us to make sense of the overall direction of religious change. Most groups adopt or reject practices in relation to Pentecostal Christianity. I would now like to use this opportunity to raise two questions that extend a little bit beyond the book. They are not intended as criticism, but rather as an acknowledgement of the fertile ground the book establishes. So Marloes, please feel free to either respond or ignore them. As you see there. My first question is this: is there a way in which the idea of assemblage can reflect the distinctness of different religious traditions? In other words, can it help us to understand how and why some religious traditions or framework are more open to the inclusion of practices than others? Can we explain why Natsford embraced nighttime prayer with other groups such as ECK do not? Right? So can it take account of the distinct space carved out by different traditions for what they consider central to religion or a good life? Could it perhaps even include secularism as a source of ideas appropriated by others, or as a framework for understanding that is potentially open to more explicitly religious ideas? And I feel that at that point, we are perhaps all thinking about similar phenomena. In a similar vein, I wondered if the concept of assemblage can be historicized. In particular, can we understand Pentecostalism, which is currently something of a fixed variable in the book, as a product of assemblage as well? The reason I ask this question is that significant research on African Christianity focuses on how it resonates with distinctly African constitutional elements and understandings of the spiritual. But in the Yoruba case, we also know that Islam has had strong influences on African Christian practices. For example, in his book, Aladura, a religious movement among the Yoruba, John Peel discusses the adoption of night vigils by Aladura Christians from Tahajjud Muslim prayers in the early churches in the 1930s. Pointing also reiterates in his last book, Christianity, Islam, and Orisha, religion. Right? So how do we think about these movements, the invention of the typically Aladura and later Pentecostal forms of nighttime prayer, but also the movement back across the boundary of those practices into Natsford, for example. So, to push this question further, if all religions are the product of historical assemblage, what should we actually study? Instead of religions, do we need to pay attention to the actual practices which cross religious boundaries, such as, for example, Tahajjud and night vigils, but also other forms of activity, including always prayer, possession, forms of knowledge such as education and music, and perhaps even distinctive attitudes cultivated in the context of particular traditions. While the study of the history of nighttime prayer in different religions may seem bewildering at first, I actually think that it offers us an opportunity for an exciting theoretical development. It would take us away from the anonymity of religious shopping and encourage us instead to explore how distinct practices appeal to men and women, youth and elders, and other social groups at different times and places. That could underpin an approach to religious multiplicity that foregrounds the social and spiritual world of distinct groups of believers and the historical contingency of their choices.
Thank you very much also for keeping to the time allotted. I want to appreciate the fact that it also boils down to the question of what is Pentecostal announcement. We have a night prayer or the Al-Juk. It has been established that that was original to the Islamic tradition, which was of course borrowed by the Arab. So that's an area that Isa also wrote that. This idea of something being allowed in one or being open in one and not closed in the other, so to say, has to be properly contextualized and explained properly to ensure that we are safe and reasonable ground. So thank you very much. I think the next person, probably the last, if Mustafa doesn't join us, Professor Bonari, Council of Foreign Relations, for his presentation. Ebenezer, you're welcome.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Sonny, and thank you, colleagues. It's really a pleasure to be here. Mine is not going to be long. I was cognizant of the fact that I was going to be the last speaker, and I knew that my colleagues, I anticipated that you will have done an excellent summary of Marloes' work, and you've done exactly that. And then two, I took to heart Professor Sonny's instruction to all of us, the speakers, to emphasize a particular element of the book that I wanted to talk about. And I looked at the title. I didn't want to say anything about the title. And then I went back into the book. By the way, I have a very special relationship with this book. I read it as a raw. Oh, okay. Yes. We're back. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Okay. So I read the book as a manuscript. I wrote a blog for it, and then I was really honored to have been asked at some point to nominate it for an award, which I enthusiastically did. So I'm a lover of the book. I love the thesis. It's a great book. But I didn't receive Professor Sonny's instruction to just focus on a particular element. I went back into the book, and it occurred to me that maybe I should say something about the closing glee, the final chapter, which is about pluralism. Birgit sort of mentioned some of the things I was going to actually talk about, but the questions I have, they are not necessarily for Marloes alone, maybe for all of us as students of as religious studies scholars, and they are constellated, around the whole question of, and I hope I'm not sounding as a reactionary. I wonder whether pluralism is overrated, and that's the question I want to ask: is pluralism overrated? I'm asking because of these 4 or 5 questions that I want to motivate us with. What happens to difference or the kind of antagonism that is not necessarily antithetical to or destructive for social cohesion? And do we sort of overlook that in our otherwise legitimate embrace of pluralism? So that would be my first question. The second one, which I think is sort of related to that, is in our quest for pluralism, to study pluralism and to celebrate pluralism, how do we avoid spiritual flattening and or spiritual homogenization? And then pertinent to that again is, what are the limits of religious pluralism? And insofar as it is a good, is this something that we can actually have too much of? On paper, pluralism, especially the way it is conceptualized in the book, is the friend of diversity. But is there, whisper it, a coercive element to pluralism, right? So that when you live under the umbrella of pluralism, do members of religious or faith communities feel propelled to dwell under that umbrella? And is there an element of soft coercion, to pluralism? Which makes me think, much more specifically of boundaries, right? And there, so the whole notion of crossing boundaries, right, which is extremely important, and again, it's worth celebrating. But are there boundaries that are worth preserving? And aren't we in a hurry to overlook, sometimes overwrite, delete or sacrifice some of them to the sweet-sounding goal of pluralism? What are the practical theological utilities of boundaries? Or shouldn't we at least try to be preserving some of them, especially insofar as they allow religious vitalism to come into play? Two more questions. The last question begs to what differences are worth preserving? And more important, especially in a Lagos Yoruba context, how do religious communities go about preserving them? In a manner of speaking, how is the firewall of purity policed and surveilled? Because it's not always that people want to give up, nostrums and ideas and commitment, right? Which ones do they choose to preserve? Which ones do they say, I'm not going to cross the boundary with this one? And how do they, put up the firewall and police them? And to borrow the whole idea of a religious marketplace, which I really like, which I've used in the past, how do religious preserve product differentiation? So those are some of the thoughts that occur to me, again, constellated around the idea of whether we're overrating pluralism as an idea, as a social project. But all of that is to say, I really, really love Marloes' work, not just this one, the one before it. I find her work very enterprising. She makes me, think very, critically, about my own work. And I hope she finds these questions, useful. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And I think the last question you posed, I don't know whether it has to do with differences that are worth preserving, or if we got that right, or what was the last question you were trying to get across to us? Can you remind me?
I was taking. Yeah, I can hear you. I was taking a riff on the idea of spiritual marketplace, which I really like. Okay. The idea that different shoppers within a religious marketplace look for different products. And I'm suggesting that it then raises the question of product differentiation, right? How do religious enterprises, to the extent that different religious communities can be reduced to religious enterprises, how do they maintain product differentiation? How is it that my Pepsodent does not become your McLean? How is it that my Omo does not become your Surf? How is it that when those shoppers come to the religious marketplace, they're able to say, this one belongs to X versus this one belongs to Z?
Thank you very much. I think we seem to be overstretching this idea of marketplace, shopping something in terms of purely material items. And people who are more religious think of the other worldly than this world. So in that particular arena, they are not thinking of shopping for anything but for salvation, afterlife salvation, so to say. And that is why this idea of commodification of religion, we have to be extra careful about the way Africans or Lagosians or the Yoruba for that matter perceive religion or conceive of religion as against the Western model, so to say. And prosperity, of course, now is the essence of the prosperity doctrine. But again, the ultimate is to be the eternal world, seems to be the ultimate. Everybody seems to be. But again, for argument purposes, we have to accept that idea of the marketplace or the shopping arena or trade fair or whatever. Well, I think I want to allow people from the audience to ask some questions so that our author can take everything together and respond. That is okay. If anybody has anything to ask them, either from the author or from the discussion, you can take that all together and then we ask the author to respond. So just let us identify yourself. If you are a shopper or a marketplace, and your question or clarification, anybody? Okay. Your name, please, and the institution. You don't mind.
Hi, my name is Bamidele. Thank you for the review and also for the book. So I think I will buy it. And so I have a question. I would like to know if some interviews were conducted in Yoruba directly. No. I think English is not always sufficient to understand deep down and to get to the essence of things.
Any other question from the audience or the parents or presentation? Yes, the name and the institution you represent.
Philomena Egben, University of Lagos, Philosophy Department. Yeah, what I seem to understand this question of religious shopping. I know people move from one religion to another for their personal reason. Some just want to know what is happening in other religions. Some do genuinely move because, just like you said a short while ago, they know the difference between one religion and another. I can point to myself as an example. 2018, I decided to leave the Catholic Church for MFM, Mountain on Fire and Miracle Ministry, because I was experiencing some problems, which I thought the Catholic Church or the Reverend Fathers will not be able to handle. Because when you go to them for counseling, at the end of the day, it's like, read this rosary and so on. I have done that on several occasions and I didn't find solution. So I decided to give MFM a try. And I must tell you today, I'm happier for it, for the change. Before, I wouldn't say I could stand before anybody or a gathering like this and say something. But because I've been in that church and I've been able, one, to do their membership, 1 year membership, whatever, and discipleship that lasted for 1.5 years. We just graduated November last year. So I've been able to learn a lot. And the problems I took there have been solved. And now I know how to pray and fast day and night. And I seem to be on top of the situation. And I will say, God hears my prayer and I'm getting satisfaction more than, yes. So I must tell you that crossing a religious boundary, for people that have genuinely done that for problem solving, personal reasons, have benefited. And I can point to myself as one of those people that.
Any other question, any questions, any clarifications? Okay, now, okay, so now come back to Marloes. You want to repeat all or any of those words? Go ahead.
Oh, that's not an easy task, but I would like to thank everyone, my fellow panelists, the people in the audience who unfortunately I cannot see, but I could hear, for all your very useful questions. They give me a lot of food for thought, so I can't answer all points, but I want to pick out some points if that's okay. And I hope there will be other opportunities for us to continue the discussion, because I think the questions which were raised by all panelists, they don't only address my work. I think it would be important also with regard to Birgit's earlier point about mobilizing theory, that we continue the discussion in different platforms with different people, including religious leaders themselves. So thank you all very much. Let me try to be brief and Unfortunately, Mustafa Bello cannot be here. He just sent me a text. Unfortunately, very sadly, he lost someone. He's at a funeral. And I wish he could have been here because Mustafa and I have worked very closely together. And if he was here, I would have let him answer Amidou's first question about whether Nasfat can be discussed in terms of a kind of Pentecostal Islam and whether the people within Nasfat would agree with that. Well, you would be surprised, Amidou, to hear that the people with whom we worked in Nasfat agreed that they were influenced by Pentecostalism. So as many of the panelists mentioned, Pentecostalism is really dominating the public sphere up to the extent that my brother Ebenezer talks about a kind of Pentecostal revolution going on. So I think Nasfat has been, not only Nasfat, also other Islamic organizations have been in. Borrowing is taking place. It mentioned something very important. It's going in both directions. It's not only the Muslim had some form of night vigils, and I'm glad that you mentioned the work of John Peel, and I think John Peel has been our mentor and source of inspiration for all of us here. So I think that's really important. It's a term used for self-identification, and for that reason I found it hard not to use it, but you are right, it has some limitations. And you mentioned something very important, Birgit. So this pluralism is part of everyday living, but we find it difficult to conceptualize it. And that's something which also Benjamin Soares, to whose work okay, Ebenezer just left us. He sent me a message. He has another meeting, but he's extending his greetings and his thanks to Amadou, to the rest of the panel. What was I saying about conceptualizing pluralism? Why you find that difficult? And it has to do also with the way we are trained. I'm an anthropologist of religion. Early on in my career, I had to choose between Islam or Christianity. I started by studying Islam. I later realized I can't study Islam without paying attention to also Christianity. So the way we are thinking is very much according to binary constructions. And how do we cross these boundaries? And that's important if we want to mobilize theory, as Birgit mentioned. So it's still very common for one scholar to focus on Christianity, another one on Islam, the third one on so-called African traditional religion, a very problematic term. And I think that also became clear in the discussion today. So how do we talk to each other if we have these disciplinary boundaries? So how can we cross not only religious boundaries, but also disciplinary boundaries? And I think that's necessary if we want to mobilize theory, as Birgit called for it in one of her recent publications. So, and that's something I must admit I found difficult myself, because initially I found it very difficult to come to terms with Chrislam myself, being trained in a Christian tradition or being raised in a Christian tradition. I initially saw this as a contradiction in terms. So that brings me to the points raised by Ebenezer, whether pluralism is overrated. Yes, it might be overrated, but we shouldn't forget that pluralism is very much part of everyday living in Yoruba land. So, for example, it's very common to grow up in a Yoruba family where your father is a practicing Muslim, your mother is a Christian, and you can choose between the two. And because of that, pluralism is very much embedded in social life. That doesn't mean that everyone would practice these practices of religious pluralism. So I hope my book doesn't give the impression that boundaries do not exist. I think, as mentioned by all panelists, religious differences are important as differences, but they're not always seen as a problem. That doesn't mean that everyone wants to cross boundaries all the time. And I think what's really important is that we also look to class. So the people who are part of Chrislam are often from a lower class rather than a higher class. And if you grow up in an environment where poverty is kind of dominating your everyday life, you think that by picking and choosing elements from different religious traditions, it might be very pragmatic, because if you don't find blessing in the church or in the mosque, why not combine the powers of both of them in order to be delivered, a term which was often used by my interlocutors. That brings me to the point of Inza about assemblage. I think why assemblage for me is a better analytical tool than syncretism is that in syncretism, different religious traditions are mixed in a kind of new religion, in a syncretic religion. Whereas what is important for me is that boundaries exist. People see Christianity and Islam as separate. And because they each have their own powers, people can hedge their bets, as it were, a very pragmatic approach to religion in order to increase their chances of having a good life. So I think that for me is really important, that differences do exist and assemblage takes into account that these boundaries exist. I think Vicky mentioned very important points about secularism, and Birgit also brought that up, the role of the state in managing religious pluralism. And that's a very difficult question, especially in Nigeria. And it's a pity that Ebenezer had to leave, because he has written a lot about secularism. So I think what I want to emphasize is that there is for me, a kind of paradox of Nigerian politics. And that is that pluriform religious movements such as Chrislam, such as Nasfat, and other religious movements, which is central in my book, they warrant the country's secular status. And that's also a point made by Ilisami in his work on religious pluralism in Nigeria. So I think that Chrislam could emerge because of Section 10 of the Nigerian Constitution, stating, and here I quote from the Constitution, that the government of the federation or of a state shall not adopt any religion as a state religion. And what I found really interesting, and Vicky mentioned that, and I elaborate on that in one of my case studies in chapter 3, is that although the Nigerian state is secular, it still banned one of the later Chrislam movements as an unlawful society. So what you see here is that the secular state is giving a kind of messages about what normative religion is, right? And so that presented me with a kind of a dilemma. So how is it possible that the two movements, Chrislam movements on which I focus in my book, are allowed, whereas the third movement, Jamia Yusuf's movement, a kind of more recent Chrislam movement, was banned as an unlawful society? And I don't have a clear answer to that, but I think the reason was because Jamia Yusuf, that Chrislam leader, was trained in an Islamic school in Agege. Well, the people in the audience would be familiar with that school. And so he presented himself as an Islamic scholar. And based on the fact that he was an Islamic scholar and then questioned the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran as an authentic source, I think positioned him in a very difficult position. But it shows that the state plays a very important role in managing religious pluralism. And what I also find interesting is the secularization of Yoruba religion. It is often taken out of the category of religion, and it's presented as part of cultural heritage. And for that reason, people find it quite comfortable to engage with Yoruba religion, even if you are practicing Muslim or Christian, because it's almost secularized, right? And I think what all these examples show, and what also became very clear from Vicky's very interesting intervention, is that the boundary between religion and secularism, as it is often made in the Western world, does not really stand and is highly problematic. And its assemblage helps us to think across these boundaries. And the final point I want to make is in reference to Ebenezer's work. And it's really a pity that he's not here. And he talks about a Pentecostal presidency in which politicians are pastors and vice versa. So religion has become very much entrenched in Nigeria's public domain, and therefore it's really difficult to uphold this conventional distinction between religion and secularism. What else? What the audience asked, whether the interviews were conducted in Yoruba. Well, most of the interlocutors spoke English, so we conducted most interviews in English. Where people didn't speak English, I always worked together with a research collaborator who helped me translate from Yoruba into English. But language is really important. Birgit, I was impressed. You mentioned a Yoruba term for religious shopping. So I think therefore it is
Italia, but thanks to Google Translate, you have a lot of, also with Ewe, for example, you can easily translate now things into it via Google Translate. It's quite a development.
But I think it's really important that we work with the in the languages with which our research interlocutors are most familiar. And then in response to the second question from the audience, and unfortunately I didn't see you, but I could hear you, about this religious shopping. I think what you showed very beautifully in your intervention is that it's, for many people, it can be a kind of temporary stage. So it doesn't mean that people are moving in and out of religions all the time, but it can be a certain stage in your life where you need deliverance, where you're more prone to borrow from religious traditions. And I think as both Inza and Vicky mentioned, some religions are more open to inclusion than others. And I think the grill movement and Akanka are examples of that. And I find it really interesting, but also difficult to understand, because these are exogenous movements coming from the US and from Austria, in the case of the grill movement, which have then become internalized. And I find that kind of borrowing and appropriation process quite interesting. And I try to understand why people were seeking for this kind of new spirituality, seeking, a term mentioned by Inza, right? And I thought it was quite interesting that people within that movement said that they were quite fed up with the too muchness of Pentecostalism, which is really dominating the public sphere. And they were keen to, they were open to experiment with something else. But anyway, I've been talking a lot. It would be nice to open a discussion, because as Ebenezer mentioned, these questions are not only addressing my book, I think it addresses all our work here, people sitting on the table and people in the Zoom boxes. So I would be interested to hear what my colleagues think.
Thank you very much. I think one note of caution I want to sound for those who want to rely on Google Translate is that you have the word bank, for example. If I'm not sure whether you're talking to bank where you keep your money, or a blood bank, or the bank of your river. So you may end up having a wrong translation. And apart from that, the Google might assist you to translate the word, so to say, or the sentence. But if you are having an interlocutor, you can't translate the emotion or the spirit or behind that the expression itself. So you are going to have word translated, not the underlying spirit or emotion. In any case, then I have nothing at all. Anyway, so I don't think we have any other question. Otherwise, we are coming to the end of our session. Let's question. Well, I think thank you, but it's been a very wonderful experience. And I think I want to suggest that some of these ideas, interjections can be taken on board sometimes later as a point of reference or as a point of further investigation, either by the author by trying to have a second edition of the book, or by those of us who are here who are interested in pursuing the thing for the book. I mean, the essence of scholarship, that something you say in the morning, but actually change in the evening. When you have any insight, when you have any ideas, when you have any challenges, and that's the essence of the scholarship. So I thank you very much for the attention and for being part of this wonderful project. Thank you very much, Marloes.
Thank you very much, Amadou. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It was great to join you from Hamburg. Thanks a lot.
And our technical crews too, I want to thank them for keeping faith with us. in spite of the
Yeah.
hiccup.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and we appreciate it.
See you in real life at some point.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that would be nice.
Bye.
Thanks, Birgit. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.
Bye.